a longtime partner. A longtime partner. So thank you so much, Andre, for being here to tell you more about the Hudson Valley Funders Network, who is sponsoring this event today.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan, and welcome all of you. And thank you for joining us today. The Hudson Valley Funders Network is very pleased to offer this webinar with our partner, Nikon. The Hudson Valley Funders Network recognizes and celebrates the nonprofit organizations in the Hudson Valley region that provide critical services as you are essential to every facet of our communities. The network wants to help you carry out your mission. And through our website, hudsonvalleyfundersnetwork.org, you can find more information about the network and access educational resources and webinars. We're here today in response to what we learned from you, that after the release of the report, Mission and More, the Economic Power of the Hudson Valley's Nonprofit Sector, and its relevant webinar, and also the 2 webinars presented on how to access the American Rescue Plan funds, you wanted more information on how to advocate for your organizations and the nonprofit community. So I'm pleased that Susan Abbott, Brian Doyle, Vincent Marone, and Doug Sauer are bringing their expertise and experience to share with us today. Thanks again to all of you. Megan?
Great. Thanks, Andrea. So before I turn it over to Doug to moderate today's event, just one other housekeeping note is we do encourage participation. So definitely you can either raise your virtual hand there at the bottom of the screen, and Sue will unmute you so you can ask a question, or definitely feel free to type your question in the chat box. Will work as well. And we will try to get in as many questions and comments as we possibly can. And with that, let me turn over to Doug Sauer, who I'm happy to introduce. He's the former longtime CEO of Nikon, and we're very grateful to him for bringing his expertise and for continuing to do some work with us to support us at Nikon. So thank you, Doug, and I will turn it to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan and Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here to help with this. This is a little bit of a different session than the typical advocacy, as Andrea alluded to, when particularly around the American Rescue Plan money, we found a lot of nonprofits didn't even have local political relationships with their elected officials, whether it's municipal or county, much less state. And so we focused this on community advocacy, local relationship building. And of course, it moves up from there. We also wanted to focus on real life practical things, not keep it in a theoretical realm or typical kind of how to lobby and what lobbying means and how do you go about doing that. We wanted to inject facts as well as very practical experiences at the local level, both in the human services and arts world. So our panel will definitely help us that way. We have 3 panel members: Vince Marone, who's the head of Public Strategies, LLC. Vince is a longtime advocate in human services, social worker by profession, if I recall, Vince, right? And he'll introduce himself, but he knows nonprofits, he knows state of Albany, lobbying in the halls there, and he knows how to build relationships. And Vince is going to talk a bit about how we level the playing field, what the rules are and what the myths are. I do want to say there is a Public Strategies document that he put out in lobbying and not-for-profit organizations. That document is available in the chat, and I believe it was emailed out to everyone this morning. So that kind of, he'll be drawing from that in terms of what you can do, what you can't do, and just kind of opening up the field. We're then going to go to Susan Abbott, who's Director of Grant Programs for Arts Westchester, and she'll introduce herself a little bit more, and she'll talk about her experiences and developing and cultivating these relationships and working them from the arts and a nonprofit point of view. And then Brian Doyle, who's the former CEO, just retired. And congratulations, Brian. I hear you got honored at Marist College this morning. So he's fresh off of that experience. Longtime Director of Family Services, and has, if you know, the Family Services Inc. has a variety of different funding sources at the state and county and local level, very broad in scope. And so he will have a lot to add, I think, in terms of the topic here. So I'll turn it over to Vince first, who will present. Each speaker is going to speak about 5 minutes, and we're going to go into a question and answer. I'll work with the speakers, and then we're going out to the group. So Vince, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Doug, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So if we can put that document up, Sue, I'm not sure how we go about that, but there is a document that sort of walks through some rules for nonprofits on how you engage in advocacy and lobbying. And just by way of clarifying what I do for a living, I am a lobbyist in Albany. I am an MSW, but I'm more the community organizing kind of social worker, not the direct service counselor kind of lobbyist. I'm a social worker, apologize for that. So the bottom line is that it is legal for nonprofits to lobby. A lot of nonprofits that I work with and do political skills training on think it's not legal for them to do that. Pretty much all my clients are nonprofits. And there's a couple of ways to look at that. There's two sets of rules that nonprofits have to deal with, but fundamentally it is legal. There's two sets of rules related to this. I'm not going through this whole document because it's a little dense, but you can have it for reference, and we can go through specific questions that people have during this webinar. The two sets of rules are federal. The federal relates to your C3 status. And then there's state rules that are really, it's a system of reporting that you have to do under the Commission on Integrity and Lobbying in Government, which regulates lobbying in New York State. As far as your C3 status goes, it's really a question of registering with them properly. And I would encourage people to elect for what's called a 501H election under the federal tax law. That 501H election gives you a set of very specific guidelines for what you can spend on lobbying. And those guidelines are very liberal. If you look through the document, and actually should go back to the other page, Sue, if you could, it sort of walks through the numbers of that. Again, I won't go through it, but you can see your example right there. If you had $1.5 million budget, you could legally spend almost $250,000 on lobbying and not have any issues with your C3 status. There's some exemptions to the federal rules when it comes to what's technically considered lobbying. So if you're doing things such as self-defense, somebody cut your budget, for example, that's not considered lobbying by the federal government. So that money would not count towards your 501H election. If you did some sort of nonpartisan analysis, that also would not count towards your number for your H election. If you're just providing technical assistance, or you're just broadly involved on social issues, talking about, issue, but not really getting into legislation or money, then none of that is covered and would not be included in what the federal government would consider the amount of money that you're spending on lobbying. So there's really very, very clear rules for under the federal government's protocol for lobbying. And again, I would encourage folks to make that 501H election. If you don't know about it, I can share more for folks individually on this, or I would say talk to your accountant about it. They certainly are aware of it. It's a one-page form. And once you make that election, you just follow those guidelines. Very simple. From the state's point of view, it's a reporting regimen. And the reason for that basically is to make sure that there's clarity on who's lobbying who and how much you're spending and what the rules are related to how you lobby. Engaging with any government entity in New York, if you're in an entity or municipality of 50,000 or more, is considered lobbying in New York. You have to register if you spend $5,000 or more. So if you spend $5,000 a year on lobbying, you need to register with the state. And in the city, you would register with an entity in the city of New York. But in the Hudson Valley, it would be the Commission on Ethics and Lobbying in Government that you would register with. And that involves meeting with almost anybody. It's not just state legislators, it's not just their staff, it's not the governor's office, it's any state agency, any rulemaking body. The only entity in the state that's not covered by the lobbying law is the Board of Regents. And the reason for that is the Board of Regents is a voluntary body. And so they're not covered, not considered lobbying when you talk to somebody on the Board of Regents. But basically everybody else is covered. And in order to comply with the law, you need to register if you spend more than $5,000 a year. And you'll see on the document, it talks about what kinds of things are covered. And as I said, pretty much everything is covered, no matter what you're working on, whether it's a regulatory rule, you're asking for a law to be changed, you're looking for money, any kind of influence you're seeking is considered lobbying under the state ethics law. And you would have to register if you spend more than $5,000. There are some prohibitions in the lobby law. The most obvious ones are you can't give a gift to a public official. Gifts are defined anything over $15. So if it's less than $15, you can buy them soda, that's okay. You probably can't buy them dinner. And the other prohibition is on what's called a contingency retainer. So you could not hire somebody like me and say, Vince, I'm going to give you $10,000 to lobby in this, but if you succeed, I'm going to give you $100,000. That's illegal. And the reason that's illegal is they don't want to incentivize trying to get something done, where you could say, if you're going to give me an extra 100,000 to achieve something, I could go to an elected official and say, look, I'm going to get 100,000 to achieve this. If you do it, I'll give you 50. Right. So that's the reason for that prohibition. I know we're trying to cover a lot of ground today, so I'll stop there and we can get into questions on the particulars as we go through the webinar.
Yeah, and Vince, just to clarify a couple of points that you made. One is at the federal level, you can take the H election, which gives you a dollar percentage that you can essentially lobby on. And that is generally both for the state and the feds. Most of that is time and effort. If you're on a salaried, that's what you're not spending cash necessarily. If you're spending time as a salaried employee, you're lobbying and the value of your time. Is that correct?
Right. You would basically you have to first of all figure out what is actually lobbying. There are specific things that aren't lobbying, right? So it's only the time that you're actually lobbying, and then you would just prorate your hours, how much time you spend doing that, to calculate how much you spend. For most agencies, you would come nowhere near this. I mean, I work with huge agencies that do a ton of lobbying, all year long, city and state. They come nowhere near these limits. You would have to really be, paying for buses to Albany and buying ads, and you have to spend a pretty impressive amount of money to approach the H limits that the federal government sets up. So that's
and then the second point you made was at the state level, you may have contractual limitations on what money you may spend for what, like usually state contracts tell you can't use that money for lobbying. So you got to be careful about whose money. But at the state level, they do not say you can't lobby. The lobbying laws are around disclosure only.
Yeah, there's no issue. The state doesn't care about nonprofits lobbying. What they care about is reporting what you're doing.
Okay.
If you spend more than $5,000, but there's no prohibition on anybody lobbying. If nonprofits couldn't lobby in Albany, Albany would be empty. Nonprofits.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to Sue to kind of tell us her experiences. You may want to, I don't know if Sue, if you have any questions you want to add from what Vince was saying. Sue Abbott from Arts Westchester.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Doug. Thank you to Nikon and the Funders Network for hosting this event and for inviting me. Actually, a lot of what Vince was just speaking to, I have experience with. So I'll back up a step. I am the Director of the Grant Programs for Arts Westchester. We are the dedicated Arts Council for Westchester County, and we also serve Rockland County with some of our grant programs. We collectively, over the course of a given year, have a funding pool of just over $2 million, which is a combination of funding that we receive from New York State, the New York State Arts Council, as well as Westchester County. And there's a life cycle to this. This is funding that we have to apply for, advocate for, nearly year over year. My background, just to tell you a little bit more about me, I grew up in Riverdale in the Bronx. I have a background in theater management and stage managing. I got an MFA in performing arts management from Brooklyn College, and I've been with Arts Westchester just over 7.5, going on 8 years. And in that time, I've seen our network grow and our funding grow, which is tied directly to our advocacy efforts. So over the course of all of our funding and year over year, we have about a dozen different grant programs that don't each run every single year, and they each have a very targeted purpose. Most of it is project-based funding. We can fund individual artists, we can fund education initiatives, we can fund programs that help the community for mental health awareness and needs there. So we try to touch on a lot of different areas and try to serve the needs of Westchester County and Rockland County. And at the moment, I think we're probably in the neighborhood of about 200 plus grant recipients, both individuals and organizations of varying sizes across Westchester County and Rockland County. What Vince touched on with the reporting is something that I have familiarity with, because with our activities, we have registered with the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. And on a bi-monthly basis, I report the staff time, the efforts that largely our CEO, Janet Langsam, but also occasionally myself or some other staff have spent time on, because our CEO is having conversations with Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. She is having conversations with our county executive. And these are conversations around budget and support for the arts and culture. So we were advised several years ago that we needed to register to report that effort. And as Ben said, I don't think we come anywhere near our thresholds, but it's just something that we need to stay mindful of. With this whole idea of advocacy, this is a conversation that we have a lot with our grantees, because we try to support all of our organizations on artists on multiple different levels. So it's funding, but it's also networking and just kind of general capacity building. And I think sometimes this word advocacy, it has a lot of weight to it and a bit of gravitas that I think maybe gets a little intimidating, where people might assume they hear advocacy and they think I have to take a bus and go to Albany, or I need to have all these very heavy sit down one-on-one conversations with elected officials. And that is certainly part of the relationship. But I think that word relationship, the title of today's session, really hits on what advocacy is, because it is relationships and conversations and building that awareness. So to give two real-time examples from Arts Westchester, we just held a large-scale festival in downtown White Plains. We'd gotten some funding, and it was a 5-day music and visual arts festival. And we worked very closely with the mayor of White Plains, Tom Roach, because we were trying to install public art. And so we needed his input and his guidance to identify the spaces that were vacant that could accommodate public art. So it was a very, very open, very engaged conversation where the mayor had a hand in helping us develop this program. And that, to me, builds on relationships and advocacy. Hand in hand with that, right now is actually the budget season for Westchester County. So as I said, all these things are cyclical. I kind of describe it to a lot of folks as the circle of life, if you will, where our funding capacity is only as great as the funding that we're able to secure. And it's not a given. It's never a given. We never know what is going to happen year over year. And we always have to have the conversation. So at this time of year, County Executive George Latimer for Westchester County is working on his executive budget for the 2023 calendar year. So there are meetings happening. There are town hall open forums where anyone from the community can sign up, and they're granted 3 minutes of open time to speak to whatever cause they feel strongly about. So it could be the arts, it could be food insecurity, it could be immigration, it could be domestic violence, it could be anything. And that is certainly a part of advocacy. But what I try to encourage our grantees to start to think about is thinking about relationships. It's almost like any kind of relationship when you're just starting to get to know someone. What are they interested in? What are you interested in? What is it that you each hope to see for the community? What are the strengths and the assets that your organization already has? And so then looking for opportunities to engage on things that are kind of low lift, if you will. So we're not coming right out of the gate and saying, hey, I need $1 million because I need to replace the roof on my facility. That might be something that you're trying to get to, but you need to lay that groundwork. And we always encourage folks, invite a local official, invite your mayor, invite your town legislator to an event. Give them the opportunity to say a welcome. Anything that engages them without the inherent ask attached to it. And then that starts to build the conversation, and you get to know their priorities, their background. Are they an educator? Is mental health awareness something that they feel really strongly about? So the more that you can have a conversation, the more you can then build that awareness. So when you get to the point of the ask, you already have laid that groundwork to get there.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. Brian?
Well, thank you. But I first want to say that the earlier discussion around the laws surrounding lobbying made me think perhaps I've been in violation of those laws. But since I'm no longer the CEO Don't need to be concerned about that. Seriously, I don't think we, our advocacy goes to the point of needing to register in terms of lobbying. I want to pick up on some of what Sue was saying, and that key word, and that is relationship. That is so important to be about developing relationships with policymakers, local officials, clearly, and not only the elected officials, let's say, but also those people who work within their office. Could be the chief of staff, it could be the district office head, it could be the legislative clerk in a county. We recently had a situation in one county where one of our programs was proposed by the county executive's office to be cut by half. And we really had to engage with the legislature to have that funding restored. And we had to do it in what I thought needed to be a very careful manner, building relationships with some of the legislators that we knew, others that we had not been familiar with, but depending upon their place on committee, et cetera, we needed to really connect with. And at the same time, doing so without alienating, without putting the county executive's office in a poor light. And that was a tricky balancing act. We needed to bring forth data that perhaps was very emphatic about the need for this program to be fully restored, and at the same time not wanting to cast the county executive's office in the role of villain. So that's a tricky thing that needs to be done when you're dealing with local counties or city, for instance. And I think that's a distinction that needs to be made in terms of funding and policy. Is it government? And even within government, is it a situation where you're seeking a member item, which is far less political than the lines in a proposed county or city budget, where the deliberations and actions can be flavored by partisan politics or even interpersonal politics within the council or the legislature, or between the county executive's office, the mayor's office, and such. But it is about relationships. It's about being emphatic and yet not wanting to make sure that we are being emphatic about making a difference, not just making a point. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Not alienating, but rather bringing people closer to your organization in partnership with them. And some officials, some people, some donors are more convinced by stories. Others are more convinced by data. So I think you need to be prepared with both. And as Sue is saying, learn what those interests are of the particular policymaker or elected official, what their own personal history is, having lost a brother perhaps to suicide, having lost, a daughter to domestic violence. So those are important things, to keep in mind. And at the same time, looking at what their interests are politically and making sure that while not being obsequious or pandering, recognizing those interests and where you can align the work that we're doing with those interests, whether it be at an event where there's an opportunity for photo or some speechifying, then giving that opportunity to that particular elected official. And some elected officials, of course, have larger egos than others, and so I think that needs to be gauged as well. I think it's very important in terms of policies, wherever possible, to join with other not-for-profits who are doing similar work and going to the policymakers together, going to the elected officials together. Unfortunately, I think policymakers, elected officials, funders often see not-for-profits as being competing with one another. And I think there's some sigh of relief when they see two not-for-profits or three not-for-profits joining together in their collaboration and not being, always in the competitive stance that unfortunately we're placed in. A number of years ago at Family Services, I became aware of a program within New York State called the SNUG program. It was a gun violence prevention program. And I thought that it would be beneficial to have such a program in Poughkeepsie, where we were based. And I approached the Division of Criminal Justice Services about the prospect. And it just so happened that the data did not support the creation of a SNUG program. That was the name of the program in Poughkeepsie. Ironically, there was not sufficient violence to warrant it. And so after that, we just kind of left it alone. We didn't hope that the gun violence would increase by any means, but we thought if there was perhaps another opportunity that came our way, we would pursue it. Interestingly, there was a group of pastors and community members from and largely persons of color who had really had it with what violence had been going on in Poughkeepsie. They joined together. They approached our agency because they wanted to go to the DCJS and seek funding for this program. And as they enlisted us, as they enlisted a local assembly person, we went to Albany, and the Division of Criminal Justice Services and the head of it, the commissioner, was so very impressed, not by our agency, but by the presence of these community members who were so emphatic in wanting to do whatever could be done to reduce gun violence in Poughkeepsie. And the funding came to Poughkeepsie, and we've been operating the Family Services SNUG program ever since. So again, there are times when the CEO, the executive director, can have an impact on policymakers, on funders, and there are times where that is better left to in partnering with community members who really represent a grassroots voice to the public officials. I think in addition to the need to be, as I said, authentic and not obsequious, and yet at the same time recognizing the interests of the funders, we need to be candid. We need to be vulnerable in terms of, letting people know where we have fallen short in our programs, in our accomplishments, and then shining a light on where we have been effective. I think always maintaining a sense of humor that puts aside sarcasm and instead embraces more in the way of self-deprecation. I think that is a very positive form of building relationships with funders. So I hope that was helpful to those who are on the call. I've been really privileged to be able to watch some very effective people in advocacy and in securing funding, and I've benefited from that, and Family Services has benefited from that.
Thank you, Brian. Say I'm off mute. I wonder if either Sue or Brian, you could talk a little bit about your board engagement. Are your board members, when you get local, everybody is local and people know people and there's network. It's not like you're lobbying somebody from outside the community in Buffalo. It's folks you know. And I know my own experience is a lot of staff want to do advocacy and stuff, and board members are hesitant. Or I've seen situations where board members are politically involved, maybe even have politicians or past elected officials on your board, and you have to navigate those relationships. Could you talk a little bit about any kind of board related experiences you have when it comes to advocacy? Yeah, Susan, sure.
Sure, happy to. So our board, we have a very sizable board. I think we're at the moment in the neighborhood of about 50 individuals, which is big. And as most boards, we operate on a committee system, and we do have a government relations committee. And it's a small committee of the board. I think it's about 4 or 5 members, but I believe every member who sits on that committee is themselves a former elected official in some capacity. Most of them are former county legislators from years past. I think one was maybe a town council person. So they are, firsthand experience, well-versed in the ins and outs of local government. And the way that we engage that committee is a couple of different facets. One from a strategy standpoint. So when we're, again, this time of year, the Westchester County government, this is, as I said, kind of high season, we'll engage that committee to talk about strategy. This is what we're thinking about asking for in terms of perhaps an increase or some targeted funding. How does the committee respond to that? Do they have any advice on how to structure the ask or what ways to go about it? And then we do also engage them sometimes more actively on having those direct conversations. Some of our board members, the former legislators, may play golf with some of the existing elected officials, or they will see them socially. So there is a way that we can engage them to their comfort level, to everyone's comfort level, to help advance some of those conversations in a way that maybe feels a little bit more collegial and less formal. But then since they have a more candid relationship, they're going to get the more organic response of, I saw the head of the budget committee out at a dinner, or I ran into them and this sounds like it's going to be a tough budget year, or, they seemed kind of responsive to the direction that we're headed in. So they're open to having this conversation. So there is a way to engage on that level. I recognize not every board, not every staff may have that ability or that relationship. We, I think, are very fortunate in that we do have that way. We have on occasion asked our board members to come to one of these budget hearings that I mentioned, which are, again, kind of an open forum to have those conversations and to ask for the funding. So I think some of it with your respective boards, it might depend on either their relationships or also their interest level or comfort level. I think doing a deep dive into where your board, where your staff is, and maybe thinking about what existing relationships they might already have is a good way to start. Doug, I have a question. I saw a question pop into the chat about ways to connect. Should I speak to that, or are we going to hold on that for now?
Hold on for sure a second. I pursue the topic, and Brian may have a little comment. So, but what you propose, what you use is a network. And you cultivate a network. And it's interesting because nonprofits do that to go find board members. They do that for donors and donations, networks, who knows who. It can be used for influencing or getting input on the political environment or the legislative environment or the funding environment as well. Yeah. Brian, do you want to respond? And we'll go to the question that's in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, what immediately comes to mind is a board member that we have who is quite politically active, okay? And while his work on the board is not, infused with his partisan beliefs or whatever, he certainly is willing on behalf of the agency to make connections with people who may be, key people in the areas of funding or even policy, and also to share some insights that I may not have about some of the dynamics within the community, within that particular political sphere, around what may be standing in the way or what might be an opportunity for us to pursue. So that's really important. And interestingly, that speaks to many board profiles, people of experience, people of, business community access. But then there are board members necessarily, and in a welcoming way, are people who may not be connected to the business community or the political community, but really are connected to the community at large and people in need within the community. And I think connecting them with others on the board so that full advantage can be taken of the different interests and the different perspectives that different board members can share with one another. That's very important as well. And then sharing with policymakers or funders.
But one more question along those lines. We just finished an election season, so there has been changes. Elected officials change. So as a nonprofit, you cultivate the relationships, then you have to kind of pivot in some ways. How about any comments about managing that? What is a changing environment? You know, what's good today may not be good tomorrow.
Well, I think you can make everything that happens today good tomorrow. If you just look at it in the correct manner. One thing that comes to my mind is we had a state senator who lost their election. This state senator was very supportive, showed up at events, etc. However, the place that state senator had in terms of side of the aisle, they did not have the access to funding that the person who has defeated her now has. And so obviously we want to in no way alienate the former state senator. We want to keep her as an ally and at the same time, pursue those opportunities that are presented by somebody coming into a seat in the Senate within our district who now has more access to funding.
Sue, any thoughts on that? And then we'll go to we encourage folks to put questions in chat or raise your hand. So Sue.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. With the term limits and someone is only going to hold their office presumably for a certain amount of time, there is kind of that Groundhog Day effect of, I've had this conversation, I've established this relationship, and 2, 4, whatever years from now, I might be having it again. Such is the nature of the work that we do. And if you're going to keep up that existing relationship, whenever possible, if there's a way to forge a connection. So using Westchester County legislators as the example, we have had a couple of seats, turnover in the last couple of years and the need for special elections. We're seeing that with Mary Jane Shimsky, who just got elected to take a seat on the assembly. So there will be a special election to replace her in Greenberg. Whenever possible, if there's a way to broker, if you will, an introduction. And most of these folks have their own network of people who keep their calendar. So there's probably going to be ways that way. But in those kind of instances, if we have existing relationships with another legislator, and Westchester County has 17 county legislators, some of whom have been in office for some time. So in those instances, we may ask an existing legislator if they could either facilitate or join a meeting. Another way that we approach the relationship with our county in particular is we hold 2 seats on our board for ex officio positions of the Westchester County legislators. So I believe they're on 2-year rotating terms. So any given year, we have 2 non-voting Westchester County legislators who hold seats on our board. And then that gives them another way to engage with us. And they're, of course, invited to all the meetings, and they can attend and they can see our inner workings and our policy. And it's another way to build that relationship. And then they can see our inner workings and we can engage them on their priorities. So it's another way that we've strategized how, and it also helps with that ever-changing slate. Every couple of years, there's going to be new folks on the Westchester County legislature. So it's another way to get them involved with us.
Great. The one question we have, and Vince, feel free to chime in too. This is to Sue. A startup organization, new, obviously without the networks. How do they make initial contact with an elected official? You don't have to be a startup. If you haven't been in this business or you haven't had these relationships, what do? Do you call them? Do you drop in? Do you schedule a phone call? What's the best result for the initial contact with an elected official that you obviously don't now have a relationship with in any way?
Yeah. I personally, I feel like I wouldn't necessarily do the drop in. I'd probably start with either an email or a phone call. Again, a lot of, at least in my experience with the county legislators, a lot of them have aides or folks who keep their calendar. So that might be a way to make the first point of entry. Hi, I'm from so-and-so organization. I'd like to invite legislator so-and-so to our ribbon cutting, to our gallery opening, to our what have you. Do you know if they have time on their calendar? So I would say either email or phone call. Myself personally, I tend to start with the email, give it about 2 or 3 days, and then follow up with a phone call if I hadn't heard back. There are folks that show up for anything and everything. There are folks that show up for almost nothing. So I think there's almost no wrong answer. I think just pick whatever you're comfortable with and just reach out.
Okay, thank you. Brian, or
I would agree with everything Sue said. What also comes to my mind is I know when I first started in my position at Family Services, that was 10 plus years ago. While I knew a lot of people in the community, there was some that I was not familiar with, and it was a great help for when our board chair set up some appointments, both with elected officials and also donors, so that there was that easy intro and transition, which made things pretty seamless.
Vince, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's complicated because, politicians function on trust, and they are wary of people they don't know. So when you're new, it's hard to engage them. I would advise somebody who's brand new to look for proxies. I think Brian suggested about your board, and actually, if you're building an organization, one of the classes of people I would think to look for on your board is somebody who has some political connections. If you're somebody who's going to be relying in any way on government funding, because unless you have those connections yourself to begin with, it's a lot easier to initiate relationships with elected officials if somebody that's involved with you, whether it's on your board or a senior staff member, knows local elected officials. Since they're not going to know your organization as something that's new, at least they know that person individually. And that just gives you a level of trust that elected officials look for. I mean, they live in a world, people walk across their transom every day asking for things. And if they don't know those people, they're immediately suspicious by and large of who you are. You don't want to go in, and I think some of our speakers spoke to this earlier, the worst thing to do is to go in never having met an elected official and just ask for something flat out. You want to get to know them. And I'm a strong believer in getting people into your buildings and into your programs, get them to know what you're doing, not asking for anything, just to get to know you, build a relationship, get them familiar with what you're doing, who you serve, learn from them, get them talking. Don't talk all the time, get them talking, find out what their interests are. And over time, you build that relationship. And then when something that you need, they sort of know who you are, who you're serving, they're familiar with you. It's a lot easier to make that.
So,
Because they wanted, I just thought of one other thing, and this idea may not work for everybody, but in my experience, as the general public gets more comfortable with going out to events in general, if you're an organization that has within your staff, your board, your volunteers, your own network, to go to events, that might be a lower pressure way to interact or just cross paths with an elected official who is also attending events themselves. It's a little bit more of a shooting in the dark kind of thing, but in my experience, events of a certain size, even a farmer's market, or some kind of festival, invariably you might see some level of elected official just there. You don't want to walk right up and go into their ask, but just keep it a kind of a low pressure, like, oh, hi, I'm with so-and-so organization. It's nice to meet you. And just kind of keep that moving. So it's another way to go out and try to engage in a way that's lower pressure.
Yeah, a nonprofit may have a service area within an elected official's city or area. But when you go visit them or you're making contact, how important it is to actually have somebody that's in that person's voting district. In other words, I live in Ulster County, but my organization's in, Dutchess. But I personally am not a constituent of that. How important is to have somebody who votes, who actually resides in that area in the meetings?
Well,
Sorry.
that's the elected official and
Yeah.
what they do. Committee chairs may have, they have a broader responsibility. So they may be willing to meet with people that aren't from their district to talk about things. If they're not a committee chair, it's a lot easier. A lot of times you don't even get the meeting if you're not from their district. They want to know why you want to meet. So having somebody local involved is very important. I would want to address the point that Sue just raised, because there's another way to go at people through those public meetings, and that's to follow them on social media. And those places, they are looking for interaction with people, because they'll post what they're doing typically on their social media accounts, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And if you're trying to track somebody down you've been a hard time getting me with, follow them on social media and see what they're doing, and go to those events, because generally they're there and they're telling people about it because they want to meet people and they want to hear from folks in the community. So use those opportunities. It's a great way to engage somebody and start a casual conversation that could lead to an invitation to your agency.
Great idea.
I would think they want to know impact. They want to know your service area. So they want to know who within their constituency are you serving? Are you serving them with food insecurity? Are you serving them with mental health, with arts, with education? So I think it was Brian that touched on some folks want to hear the kind of bigger picture esoteric. Some folks want to hear the data. We are at the moment partnering with Americans for the Arts on the economic impact survey. So we're doing a 12-month data collection, and Americans for the Arts crunches the numbers, and then they come back and they tell us, and when this was done 5 years ago, the arts contributed over $170 million in revenue back into the county by way of ancillary spending, parking, dinner, souvenirs, what have you. Having those talking points at your disposal is helpful. Americans for the Arts is actually, I find, a good resource for those of us in the arts and culture sector to have those talking points at your fingertips.
Yeah, just following up on a couple of things here. Vince said, get them in the building. And I think that's really important. And that's been particularly important for us at Family Services, as we have a 110-year-old building where significant community activities take place. And also we have significant capital needs. So, we've been touring people through, not necessarily, as Sue was saying, to make the ask on the spot, but just to familiarize people. And, different people have different ways of learning. Some just learn by, looking at and experiencing and talking to people, whether they're people who work there or people who receive services, or looking at the roof that needs replacement, et cetera, et cetera. Other people, respond more to data. We happened several years ago to commission a study from the Benjamin Center, which is, part of a think tank within SUNY New Paltz. And I think we spent $5,000, but they studied the social return on investment in terms of, how preventive services, could obviate the need for services later on in life for individuals. And we're absolutely, actually able to quantify the return on investment, whether it be from taxpayers or donors, on the services that were being provided within our building. And that was, certainly money well spent. It was very much data-driven, research-driven, but very effective for some people. But for some others, they want to hear the story of the individual whose life has been changed by a certain service.
And at our next session, we're planning, we were going to talk about story, but it's good to also introduce data. And I'm going to make the assumption that with elected officials, depending on their sophistication, how much they know about your issue or they got to be convinced by the story filled with data. But when they turn around and then go to the local county Department of Social Services or mental health, or at the state level, go to NISCA, or they go to the bureaucracy wants to hear data. Am I correct about that?
Right.
So, and they don't want to go into a circumstance, take your cause, and then get blown away because of some other relationships you might have had with the state. Can you talk about that? Because the elected official is a gateway, an influencer, but then there's a whole backup machine there. that triages and prioritizes.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And earlier, I did mention that depending upon the source of funding, it would require different information, a different approach. I mentioned that member items are pretty much, they're already baked and they are provided, as opposed to responding to an RFP that comes from a particular agency that needs to be much more data driven and specific numbers, numbers of people you anticipate serving and the cost per person, the cost per unit of service, as opposed to a member item where there's more freedom, if you will, in terms of the direction of those funds.
Sue, any thoughts about that?
I said where my mind went, and I apologize that this is a bit of a departure, but definitely the folks who engage with the data, but I was thinking about the folks who engage with the story.
Mhm.
And the way that another strategy that we employ is asking either our grantees, folks who have received our services, folks who attend our events, to write a letter of thanks or acknowledgement to the county or to whoever the funding body is. So if you, we have an arts mobile. So it's a van that is retrofitted with art supplies, and it goes around the county to farmers markets and the housing authority and senior centers. And so if someone from that senior center writes a letter to their elected official, to the county executive saying, "Dear elected official, I just experienced the arts mobile. Thank you so much for making this program possible for the folks of Westchester County." It's another way that they can receive the information. Yes, it may not move the needle for everybody, but it's also a way to engage your own networks, your own community, and ask their help in trying to make that case.
It's an excellent point. It's not just the interaction that you have, it's what's the follow-up. You're cultivating the relationship. The more you can get thank yous or other people express their appreciation to the elected official for what they did, that's just accolades. That just boosts the egos for those that don't, but also feels that they did the right thing. And it's not just a one-off kind of relationship.
Yeah, and it's not just Arts Westchester asking for money or whatever it is. It's not just our board. It's voters, it's taxpayers, it's folks from the community who are receiving the services that your funding has enabled to have happen. So they're really seeing the fruits of what that budget decision plays out into it's, oh, this person was able to have a meal, this person was able to have a scholarship to take classes, this person was able to get themselves into a better living situation because they needed to get out of the one that they were in. Yeah, it's another strategy.
And I think, I think a lot of cases, some nonprofits, they do good work and they feel they do good work, and other people just don't appreciate the good work they do. And they're not known. So there's public relations, there's other elements there of your presence in a community. But certainly the more you represent a constituency, because they think constituencies, they're elected by constituencies. So you may do the right thing, but you may not necessarily perhaps show the constituent benefit that people can come back and say, we appreciated that. I don't know, Vince, you might have some thoughts about that. It kind of goes back to the network and feeling that there's a reward there for the elected official as well.
Look, I have clients that spend a lot of time producing reports that are full of vignettes of how people benefited from the money that state invested in them to serve them around healthcare, insurance, access, student loans, for example, and trying to deal with the crisis related to student loan debt. Those things matter because, when you get back to the point of which Brian raised, which I love, which is nonprofits do not do a good job of this, and that's quantifying the value of what you do. If you spend money that's saving the state money, you want to make sure, or the county money, you better be telling them that, because somebody is paying attention to that. As long as your numbers are credible, the people that run the budgets don't always believe you. But the more you've got credibility behind what you're saying, the stronger argument you have to both keep your money and get more. And I've worked in a lot of things at state level where that was definitely the way it worked, that we were able to quantify. that what we were doing was a good investment. It's not just good politics, it's not just good for the community, it's good for the state's bottom line. And if they buy that, they will invest in it. But I think people in nonprofits don't spend enough time looking at things that way. I think that's definitely a strong suit on the approach in the arts, because a lot of people think the arts is soft. There's people in the legislature that love it, people that don't have a lot of interest in it. And I think there is a very strong case to be made. My partner works on a lot of art stuff, and they talk about economics all the time, and the economic engine that the arts is in a lot of communities all across the state. So it's a great angle, but you got to have good data. It's worth spending a little bit of money if you can't pull it together yourself to do that, because it will pay off.
I bet you just gave me the opportunity to make a pitch for the Hudson Valley Economic Impact Study that Andrea referred to, because there was a 9-county economic impact. And one of the things that actually led to this was, how do nonprofits talk about their economic impact? Their jobs, their contribution to the community, breaking down that, well, you're just a drag on the tax dollar, you're a drag on the community, it's a gift to you, turning that argument not only you investing in the good work you're doing and the lives you're improving, the quality of life, but also there's a business impact that you have, that you bring money in, you match money. I don't know, do any of you, have you made that kind of argument in any of your proposals or in your cultivation of relationships?
Oh, you bet. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that relates to the study that I referred to, that did not only speak to social return on investment, but also the economic impact by way of the employment of the staff that are within our agency, and the buying effect, and the benefits to the local community and the local businesses.
Yeah, and we've got the partnership I mentioned a minute ago with Americans for the Arts. Their survey is nationwide, and you opt in to participate, and they provide the questions, and then we have to deploy the survey. So it started over the summer, it'll wrap up in May in terms of the data collection. And then next fall, we will get the report on what the economic impact is of the arts in Westchester County. We also have, one of our grant programs is a fundraising challenge match that is supported by Westchester County funding, where you're leveraging funding available to then fundraise to then be matched. And we've been running that grant since 2007, and it's a 1-for-1 challenge match. And over the life cycle of that grant, it has leveraged or generated, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of another like $5 or $6 million in donations that was then matched by about $2 or $3 million in county money. And that is straight support going into the arts and culture sector that was generated and inspired by the support that the county provided. And we talk about that a lot, because these are big numbers, and it's a very direct, very clear one-to-one. The county supported us. The community was able to do this. Look at what we were able to do.
What kind of reaction do you get to that kind of point up front? Have either one of you run into folks saying, I don't understand that, or that there is a positive economic impact from nonprofits they see as very differently than if you're a for-profit business? Have you run into counter arguments, or folks that just say, well, we just can't afford you? We can't afford you without you. Yeah.
I think most folks, in my experience, are kind of essentially pleasantly surprised, if you will, like, oh, I didn't realize that the arts were such a driver for the county. Thank you so much. Does it always yield other great returns? I can't tell, but I think because it is such a real factor and it is significant numbers, I think it tends to be eye-opening for some folks who really just did not realize, like, oh, it's $170 million. It's 5,000 jobs. It's, millions of dollars in tourism. That's actually part of the survey that we're doing right now, trying to gauge how much of a tourism driver is this? Are folks coming in from outside of Westchester County, which is also significant, to come see an event here? So we talk about that as well. Tourism is a big factor.
This is a good example of how you can take what you do, and maybe nonprofits don't draw everybody's attention, but partner with people who are making money off what you do. And the example that Sue just gave, I would go to the hotel people in Westchester County and talk to them about the impact, and here's our study. And here's the impact that we have and how many people come and stay in hotels in Westchester County because of what we do. You know, we're trying to get more money for XYZ in Westchester County. We lobby for us with this, right? When a for-profit walks in with a nonprofit to lobby for something, politicians pay attention because they don't expect to see that. It's not a, you know, just like they don't think of nonprofits as employers or economic drivers, they don't think of nonprofits partnering with for-profits a lot. And that's a great way to really validate that there is that synergy between what the nonprofits do and what the for-profit world is doing and the money they're making in a way that's tangible, right, in their community, right? That when these guys run these concerts or these events, you know, our hotel is full.
Yeah.
So, you know, the more you do that, you know, and the restaurants are busy, right? And the gas stations, I'm like, everybody's busy because of these events, right? That's just good politics for them to understand the dynamics and the way these things are connected. And it gives them more reasons and more people to go to, because politicians listen to different things. Some people are going to love the arts or social services or substance abuse treatment, whatever you're doing, and think that's great. Others, that may not be their interest, but they care about the business community, right? You're trying to just appeal as many people as possible. So the more you can partner across different, you know, scopes of interest in the legislature or the county or at the state level, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, and I guess that also suggests if you have business people on your board or major donors, it's good to take them to the meetings.
Yes.
So they see that support, that connection in different ways. I mean, you framed it very well, Vincent. The more you can broaden their horizon about the constituency, about the stakeholders, about the overall benefit, and they see that up front, that's good. A lot of times, and I don't know if Sue and Brian, you've been in this situation, where nonprofits go to the elected officials at the point of crisis. Maybe they haven't cultivated a relationship, but crisis, or, you know, the community center is going to close or the arts program is going to close, or there's a thing in the paper and there's a reaction to that crisis. Have you ever gone in a crisis situation, either of you, where you really lost a program or there's really something really happening and it's maybe public and you're looking for that kind of support?
I think we have had those situations. However, I think it's really important to be transparent and exposing vulnerabilities so that it's not at the point of, you know, critical, you know, cliffhanging crisis that you're approaching people, but rather letting your funders know, letting your supporters know some of the difficulties that you're having all the way along, you know, even before the crisis, so that there can be a preventive approach to avoiding crisis. And I think that's part of developing trust. I don't think supporters, donors, funders want to be hearing about a crisis that could have been avoided or perhaps could have been disclosed to them earlier on. I do think that there is a fault of some not-for-profits not disclosing the problems that they're encountering until such time as it is a crisis, and people do not like being surprised, and that's understandable. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? What else is going on that you have not made me aware of? I think it's really important to be more transparent and, you know, forthcoming about what's working, what's not, and what, you know, is over the horizon that could become a crisis, but that we want to avoid.
Yeah, and it goes back to cultivating the relationship. If you're transparent, you develop trust, good times and bad times.
Right.
That you just don't go when you want something. You keep the relationship going. Susan, were you going to comment on that?
Yeah, two different scenarios popped into my head when you mentioned crisis, and it also made me think of something else that I think we've touched on, but I did want to speak to, that I think oftentimes the assumption is that it's a conversation about money, and 9.5 times it is, but sometimes there are greater needs. Maybe it's a facility or space, which is of course inherently monetized in nature, but that sometimes you might have a need that goes beyond just, I need an influx of finances. The two scenarios that came to my mind, we have our own building in downtown White Plains. It's a very old building. It's over 100 years old. It's a former bank. And we we have some structural concerns, and we in the past year or so have gotten into a bit of a pinch situation with needing to replace the boilers, needing to do work on the roof, and all that kind of fun stuff. And so we have tried to have those conversations kind of on every level that you can think of, both local and state. And it over time, I think we were able to secure some help, but it was the long game. I have not personally seen a situation where, crisis situation equaled crisis response nearly as fast as maybe the crisis might have needed. So there's always going to be something, even if there is help, it's going to be something temporary. And then maybe we can work towards the long game, but it's going to be a longer game. The other situation that came into my mind was actually a situation where there was a crisis and we tried to help be part of the solution, where there was another arts center in Westchester County, not totally similar to the work that we do, a little bit more of a maker space. And they did classes and ceramics, jewelry making, what have you, and they were losing their space. And this was something that the county was well aware of. And so we tried to not step in, but we tried to make a space within our own building available to say, let's try to see if we don't lose this organization entirely. It's not a perfect fit, but would the county consider or support moving part of this entity into our space, and maybe we can keep some of the programming going. I lost track of where that conversation went, but I use it as an example of when you're aware of other crises, can you help? Is there a resource at your disposal? And then you might generate some good feelings and good karma with your elected officials. I'm not only coming to you with need, I'm not only coming to you with crisis, I might want to be part of the solution. I recognize not everyone has the capacity for that, but I guess I voice it as another example of look for opportunity. And if there's a need in the community that you think you can help solve, bring that to your elected official. Hey, I see this organization that needs space and I have space, or this is an organization that has a whatever need. I'm going to share a resource that I have. Sharing resources is a great talking point because it might take the pressure off of your elected official. I don't need to take care of this because this is an organization that can help support that need directly.
Oh, great. We're at our end. I'm going to turn it over to Megan in a minute. I want to thank Brian, Vincent. So I think we got a lot of content. This is being recorded and there's a lot there. We are going to the next session. And I like the idea of stories infused with data and also understanding, the strategies you need to bring there. That may make for the good next session that we do, getting more specific in terms of the pitch. So Megan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Great conversation. I hope everyone attending enjoyed as much as I did. I took tons of notes. We had lots of great information. So thank you so much to our panel, to Brian, Sue, Vince, and to Doug for moderating. And thank you again to the Hudson Valley Funders Network for making this possible. And we are doing a part 2, as Doug mentioned. And once we have that date set, we will send it out to everyone who registered for this webinar. So you will have it, so you won't miss it. And also a reminder, this meeting was recorded and we will be sending out the recording to you all within about 48 hours as well. So again, thank you so much for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.